Moments of failure while learning on the job?
That bridge between commerce and art is so important because I'm not an artist. I'm not somebody who's making clothes to put it on a wall. I have to run a business. Someone said, but what are you doing? What are you doing with a makeup brand? You have skin like Om Puri. Can you imagine? Acting was never the option because my mom had clearly said, it's not on the cards for you. In those days, I remember, I think I would spend from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. in the afternoon just on calls, hearing that July 10th is the last day of the brand. It's going to shut then. And then July 15th. No, I think it's looking like August. Maybe it's going to be June. But it was wrap up.
Yeah.
House of Masaba was wrapping up. And I remember I lost that match and I was walking back and I could hear someone say, it's a pity that Viv Richards' daughter just has a fancy tennis outfit and not the
chops. So
not the chops to be a tennis superstar. And I think that was my last match.
Masaba, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For making the trip and giving us time.
Thank you.
At a really precious stage.
Yes, precious is right. Yeah.
So this is the anti-podcast. Because the idea is not to, fill the space talking about success, but actually talk about our vulnerabilities and our failures and what we've learned from them. Because I think that those are the real moments of life when we really learn, whether professionally or personally. And though that's the real value that we can add at this point. So that was the point behind this whole conversation. So I was really glad when we were able to put, time together because you have such a unique trajectory in your career and you've been so remarkably successful. And it's just amazing.
Thanks.
It's amazing, amazing work. So if I were to start with your idea of, taking on fashion, at a time when it was not as prominent as it is today. Tell me where that came from and how you thought about, I want to get into fashion. This is what I'm going to do.
The joke is that fashion found me. And I actually tried very hard to run away from it for a very long time. Because I just grew up believing that I should be in front of the camera. I grew up believing that I wanted to be a dancer, so I spent some time at Shamak Dawar's dance troupe, by the way. A lot of people don't know, but I used to be like a backstage dancer at Filmfare and IFA and Commonwealth Games in Australia, in Melbourne.
Oh, wow.
And spent a large amount of time doing that. And then there was music. I wanted to be a singer because suddenly I discovered Beyonce and I said, I'd like to be a performer. Because I knew I could dance and I had said, okay, let's give singing a shot too when India doesn't have any pop stars at the time.
Yeah.
So there was that. And then there was, these are all the things that obviously didn't work out because I don't think I was exceptional at them. I was quite bad at singing, I have to say. I was quite besura, but I kept giving it a shot. Yeah. And then I decided to become a VJ.
Okay.
And I went to give an audition to Raghu and Rajiv, if you remember.
Yes.
At MTV. And gave a very bad audition, failed miserably at that. That was when I was all of 18 actually. And then I said, man, I've tried it all now. And acting was never the option because my mom had clearly said, it's not on the cards for you. She said, listen, the industry in India has always functioned a certain way. And there are certain faces that people associate with that of an actor. This is way back.
Way back, yeah.
So she said, you'll always be considered a little bit out of the box, a little bit too artsy, a little bit like, we don't know where she belongs. You probably get like that little vamps role, something like that, the seductress.
Yeah.
So there was all that. But she just said, if you want to be a mainstream Hindi film heroine, it's not going to happen. So let it go. And I thought that was the greatest advice I ever got because it's very easy for a parent to say, yeah, beta, go and explore and do what you want. But I think I just decided that I don't want to be a supporting cast, and this is who I am. I'd like to be front and center. And I don't want to be frustrated. She said it'll be very frustrating because that's what this industry can sometimes do to you when you feel like you could be talented and you could have a certain face and a look and a vibe that may be different. But she's like, different doesn't necessarily work. So, and I saw that. I mean, you see it, right? You see the template and you understand very quickly that there is a certain face that works and you honor that. So I respected that, I honored that, and I moved on. And the next thing you know, literally next to Anupam Kher's acting school, there's an SNDT university building. And I read in bold, admissions open. And I knew that I had no options left. I had left singing in London. I had finished up with Shamak Dabas. I'd done everything I could. And I just walked right in. And the rest is history. Didn't complete my course, by the way. Because I started my label in the last year of college itself. I just applied to Lakme Fashion Week. Because I don't know why, I felt like I may have learned what I have to learn here. And Wendell Rodrigues was my mentor and teacher at the time at SNDT. And he said, why don't you just apply? We'll see what happens. And I applied and I got through. 6 of us made our debut that year.
Yes.
And I enjoyed it way too much to ever look back and say I could have done something else. And then I just decided to run with it. And very early on, I decided that this is not going to just be me having some fun with fashion and, toying with clothes. I'm going to make a retail story out of it. I was very inspired by Anita Dongre, very inspired by Ritu Kumar. I wasn't that crazy about the international guys because, it was so disheartening that in college, we were taught more about Lagerfeld and Chanel and Fendi and Schiaparelli and all these, of course, the greats. But the thing is, what are you teaching us? India doesn't even have that kind of infrastructure, appetite for fashion at the time. Luxury was a very, very distant subject.
Yes.
And I said, teach us about the people back home. Teach us about Tarun Tahiliani. Teach us about Anita Dongre. Teach us about how she built and Global Desi and Anita Dongre Bride. And teach us about Ritu Kumar, who taught us everything about textiles. And then there was a whole Miss Universe that she made so aspirational. So I said, it's just so exciting, Rohit Bal. And they just said, this is not worth teaching, in college. And I just found that so absurd. So I left and I started my own label and I learned on the job. So for the last 16 years, I've just been learning on the job. Yeah.
It's a fabulous, fabulous story. Moments of failure while learning on the job?
So many. And the thing is, I'm glad you asked me because I just find that back then and even today, the line between fame and success is so blurred.
Yeah.
As is the line between success and failure. Because I feel like what's happened is there were many collections of mine back then, even today, that don't perform very well. There are commercial disasters sometimes. And then you'll have the press write about it and say, she's back. She's risen like the phoenix from the ashes and this is the best collection yet. At the stores, in real life, it's a whole different story sometimes. You don't see those numbers that the press is talking about. Then you have Instagram, which is a whole new layer of making you believe that you're successful at something, but you're not. Because you have this bubble that is celebrating your work. But there's a whole world outside that bubble that hasn't even read about it.
Yeah.
So I find failure such a strange term and success an even stranger term because today there's no measure. What is the measure? You ask me if a hyped up kid who is the product of just exceptional PR and marketing and Godfathers, is that kid a success or a failure but has not done even one film, or has not even made their debut in fashion, has not even launched their business or shown some success. How do you measure that? You know? So I have had lots of failures. I've had, for starters, my first and second and third tested beauty, all failures, as per me.
Okay.
Because I didn't make any money off it. So I just consider that a failure. It was a success in the sense that I learned on the job. And I could apply what I learned today to make Love Child, which is, in my opinion, a success. And the numbers are there to prove it. So there's that. With House of Masaba, with apparel, we have 2 collections that do magic.
Yeah.
And then you have one that's just the worst. But the thing is, Instagram loves it. Or, you have 5 people telling you, oh my God, this is great, this is great, this is great. But it's a whole different story on the ground, So I think it's difficult to compartmentalize.
How do you turn those, 1 million likes into money and get them to actually buy something, right? That's the big question of Instagram. So you're the artist, right? Because you're the designer. But I think that the shocking part for all of us who create is that when you go into business on your own, there is the whole other side of it, which is the money and the taxation and the compliance and, raising the investments and keeping
people.
All of people. People
yeah.
are such a large part of that job.
Yeah.
What was that like? Because you started very young.
It was, it was and still is the hardest part of everything I do.
The money or the people?
Both.
Both.
I find that no money is ever enough, right? For your dream, right? Because you think that, oh, I've now done this much, I could do a little bit more. I could need a little bit more capital. You always need a little bit more. And you think that, oh, if I had this, I could do wonders. But the thing is that, see, people are, and I remember reading this quote somewhere that make your company process driven and not people driven and blah and blah. I agree with it, but I also think that people drive processes.
People are the heart.
People are the heart.
Yeah.
People create the tribe.
Yes.
They create the energy of a brand. And which is why I find it very hard, because I'm somebody, by the way, who is so sensitive to aura. And I keep telling my HR, I'm like, the aura's not right. The energy is not right. They're like, energy? It's like, what? We're not talking about energy here. And I just say, no, there's a feel. I just can't get it. But brilliant resume, can't get it. And 9 out of 10 times I've been right.
I had a friend who used to keep saying that culture eats talent for breakfast.
Yes.
You could be top shelf talent, but if you're not matching culturally, this is not going to work out.
If you don't know how to hold a team together, and that could be through emotion, it could be through something a little bit more tangible, maybe. It could be through something that I don't know what. How do you know when someone comes into your company? What drives this person? So I always try and find that answer. When I look at them, and then I do meetings with them, or I spend time with them. And now what's happened is the company's become larger, so it's become even more challenging to spend that kind of time, right? But I try and do that, and I try and gauge a person's energy, where what is this person here for?
Yeah.
And what will make them stay? And for everyone, it's a different answer.
What do you value more? And this is a really interesting thing, right? So you will have people who've been with you from the beginning. So there's loyalty. They know you. They've seen the journey. They've been part of the journey. And then the ones who come in recently have that fresh blood. They have fresh ideas. That's how you bring in change.
Yeah.
Which one is more important to you?
It's a steady mix of both. You can't function or grow with either or. You can't say, I want to hold on to everything that has run a certain way or everybody that has functioned a certain way. I mean, you have the old folks sometimes who find it so hard to transition into a new way of working. Yeah. And you have to handhold them through that. And that's fine. You must do it. It's your job. And then you have the new folks who are so hardwired into a certain, say, a corporate way of working. But you learn so much from them as well. So I think that you need that person who works like there's such a stark difference between the way the apparel business is run right now and the way my beauty business is run. They sit in the same office.
What's the difference?
There's just a different, how do I say it? There is, with apparel, I think it's very, very clearly, the business has been around 15 years, 16 years now. We know the ropes. We know what to do when shit hits the fan. We also know what to do to just push the pedal a little bit more to reach that target. Do we necessarily know, okay, we got to do these 5 more things, but there's a 6th thing that nobody's being able to point out, which is going to just take this brand on a rocket ship. We have to search for it because we've become so comfortable sometimes in our ways of work. But at Love Child, you have this energy, which is we're a startup and, we're going to be unicorns and, we're just going to we're just driving through. It's like blinkers on and going straight for it. That was how apparel was run for the first maybe 5 or 6 years. And then there was a fresh burst of energy in 2018, I remember, because the business had slumped so badly. And I remember we said, we need to do something, man. This print situation is not working. I remember I did a Mirchi print.
Yeah.
And it was the biggest disaster. And I had loved that print so much. And it was the biggest disaster in the history of House of Masaba, where not one person bought that print. And we had thans and thans of it. And I was devastated. And there was no money. And we had to keep doing things. We had to keep it rolling. But I just remember thinking, damn, we need to do something new. Now, how do you do something new when you first don't have the capital?
Yeah.
The team is small,
Everybody's a little disheartened.
Everyone's feeling a bit down. I was feeling down, so imagine how it trickled down.
Yeah.
So all of that. But I think that, and then we needed a fresh burst of energy in 2020 in COVID.
So what did you do with the Mirchi print? How did you get out of that?
I don't think I ever got out of it. I moped for a long time. But I think one day I decided that, listen, it was also a big decision for me because I remember now, I did it because I liked everything about that collection individually. But be it the fabric, be it the colorways, be it everything, the cuts, the silhouettes, I don't think everyone loved it. And that's when I decided that if I have a team, it's got to be teamwork. It can't be Masaba's choice. This brand is not what Masaba would like to wear. It's what people perceive Masaba as. Yeah. And I think that was the change. I think that day I disconnected myself or sort of, detached myself a little bit personally from the brand's professional and sort of trajectory, And I think that was when I learned that bridge between commerce and art is so important, because I'm not an artist. I'm not somebody who's making clothes to put it on a wall.
You have to also run a business.
I have to run a business. And it's a choice I've made. I could very well be that person who does 1 print a year or 3 prints a year and says, this is art, put it on your wall. It'll last and it'll appreciate, Yeah. But I don't want to do that. I want to run a business. And that day I decided that, okay, this is not a personal vanity project. It's a business. You got to do this in a different way. That's what I did differently. And that's when I actually dropped a lot of my creative ego, as they call it, because I think that gets in the way of creative people the most. I like this. This is who I am.
Yes.
But there's also a world out there that you're feeding. There's people whose livelihood depends on you.
Yes.
And if you don't want all of that, you don't want that responsibility, then make it an art project where you're seen once in 6 months and 8 months and you disappear to, the Andamans.
There is a responsibility to make money, and you can't always. Is there a warehouse somewhere with boxes and boxes of Mirchi print fabric that never got used?
I'll tell you, my mother made bed sheets out of it.
I love it.
And then she went on to make curtains out of it. And then she went, one day I walked into her house for dinner and her house help was wearing a nice kurta salwar out of it. So I said, chalo, kisi ka to use. And she said, mujhe to bahut pasand hai. It's cotton. And I loved it. So I said, great, it's come of use somewhere. But you see, if I didn't have that learning phase, I mean,
Yeah.
what fun is it to just keep doing well?
You know, this is what I'm saying. It is the moments of failure that, you know, when I always believe that when I get stuck somewhere, I feel like I sit down and say, life is trying to teach me something in this moment. And I'm being stubborn and not learning it. And that's why I'm still here. I need to
it'll keep
figure
coming
out.
at
It'll keep coming. You cannot budge from there until you learn the lesson.
Yeah.
You know, that life is trying to teach you. Like, what is it? What am I supposed to learn?
Yeah.
Look at it again. Look at it again. Walk away. Look at it again. What are you not learning from here?
Like, you know, in 2020 when COVID hit, I remember, worst time of my life, worst. I don't think that I had even like 12,000 rupees to pay my cook. It was that bad. Because we were in the middle of a fundraise, or rather just about starting our second fundraise. And it was Feb, right, in 2020. And March 2020, the lockdown happened. And we thought, okay, it's a 3-day lockdown or a 1-day lockdown. And then we were just stuck.
14 days is when we started that.
Yeah. In those 14 days, my life completely turned around. One, because I was in Goa. I was stuck there. My now husband, then boyfriend, was wrapping up his home there. He used to live there. And I just went with him. And then suddenly stuff started to look really bleak. And I think it was end of March or maybe first week April that my business head said, listen, there's no money now. It's done. It's wrapped up. Nobody's buying anything. Fashion was at the bottom of the food chain that time. You're not buying an outfit. Where are you going? I said, okay. The workers couldn't go back to their homes because there was no way for them to go back. And so the karigars, a lot of them were actually staying in the workshop. They said, is it okay if we stay here and we will, I said, we'll provide for the food and whatever you need and give them a nominal amount that will at least help them survive. And next thing you know, I said, you know what? I said, just start making masks. There is than and than of print lying, make masks. I said, it'll give us 20,000 rupees. It's okay, just make something. Some money should keep coming. And it did, a little bit. And I remember on those calls, in those days, I remember, I think I would spend from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. in the afternoon just on calls, hearing that July 10th is the last day of the brand. It's going to shut then. And then July 15th. No, I think it's looking like August. Maybe it's going to be June. But it was wrap up. House of Masaba was wrapping up. And, we were on calls with malls. We were on calls with every single store. Landlord saying, kuch rent kam kar do, make it 0, make it less, do something. Some people were very kind. We were so bad that we were getting security deposits back from certain people because we were on crazy expansion mode. We were bang in the middle of expansion. And then this happened. And I had my investors on the line saying, you should think of just wrapping up. I don't think that this is going to work. And there's going to be a different world post-COVID. So I don't think you want to continue at this rate. And we'll see what happens once the world gets back to normal. But nobody knew when that would happen. And I remember I was just, I didn't know whether I should cry or go into damage. You know how you don't know. And I think for a good 1 month, I only cried. After every call went off, I would just cry, put my video off and sob. And then I said, okay, enough of this now. This is trying to teach me something. And what it was trying to teach me is that for that whole chunk from 2009 to 2020, I made myself believe I'm a creative person and numbers is not my job. And I don't even like numbers. So why should I do it? I have a business head. He's doing it. I don't need to look at it.
Because, there's this thing that when that business head is walking here, it's like, "Arey yaar, fir se pakayega."
No, No, I mean, my business head is lovely and I'm hugely dependent on him. And he always calms me down. He's a very different temperament, very different from me. We have different styles of work. And the thing is that I know that when he's calling, I'm like, yeah, he never calls. He'll always send a message. If he's calling, something has gone wrong.
Yeah.
And all my dialed calls and received calls were him. So it was just that. And he was somehow very confident that kuch to ho jayega. But I just didn't see it. Because I'm like, you're shutting stores. We shut 5 stores in a span of 2 months. Some were franchises, so then talking them through it. Some were company owned. It was a huge mess. And I think there was some 2 lakhs in the bank account. That's it. And so we said, hold on to the 2 lakhs, keep making masks, just keep your focus and cut your losses. And I remember one day it hit me, and that's the day I stopped crying. I think it was early August, first week, where I said, you know what? I have tricked myself into believing that certain things in this business as a founder are my responsibility, but certain things aren't. Who decided that? I'm the founder. Yeah. Everything is my responsibility. I may have people to delegate things to. I may have people to handhold me, people who are far more talented, smarter at their jobs. But the fact is, everything is my business. Everything is my problem. And I have to look into it. So then I got into numbers at every level. So empowering. Yeah. When they say knowledge is power, I believe it. And that's exactly what it was trying to teach me at that time. The day that happened, I also went on a fitness focused journey. I transformed myself. I said, I'm going to transform, not just mentally.
This was during COVID.
During COVID. I said, I'm going to transform mentally, and I'm going to be so strong physically that the days my mind is giving up on me, at least my body can hold through. That was a big thing that I decided in my head. Cut to 20th August. Just 10 days before that, Netflix started reaching out and saying, hey, we've shot this show and I think we're going to release it. Masaba. I said, man, in COVID, I don't know what we'll do. Will we be able to promote it, etc.? They said, we'll do something. We have a pretty extensive plan. They sent a crew over to Goa. We did some marketing. We did everything virtually for hours every day. And I was nervous because I didn't believe it would be a hit or even anyone would watch it, because I don't think people had that temperament at the time. 20th August, it came out. And suddenly, my business head called me and he said, we did sales on the website. And I was...
This show drove sales?
Yes. Like, I have goosebumps as I say this, but I think we did some couple of lakhs, and it was just the most... I cannot tell you what it meant. Because suddenly I had some power. And I think from then on, it just went with it. Then everything after that, people started watching the show a lot more. People started discovering the brand. There was a whole new audience that discovered the brand. And it saved me. I mean, Masaba saved me, and in a time where I didn't know what else to do, because I said, I can make masks. I can try and help people save lives and not get this virus, but that's all I can do right now. And I can keep myself sane. And literally, for a year after that, things stabilized. And I didn't have to shut my label down. So, yeah, I think that...
You come out of situations like that so weather-worn, because after that, you're like, okay, this I can handle.
Yeah.
Regular non-lockdown problems I can handle.
Yeah. I'm like, even if there's a lockdown now, I got this. Yeah. I will do it. I will figure it out. Because the thing is, you have to find, and it also taught me agility of thought, of being a leader. Where saying that, just because something's been thrown at you and you have no idea how to deal with it, find the way around it. Find the way through it. Find the way that works best for you. There is a way. That's what I believe.
There's always a way.
Yeah.
So I want to roll back a little bit for when you shot Masaba Masaba, because connecting to when your mum said that acting might not be the best thing for you. And of course, with the entry of OTT and things like that, the kind of roles really changed. All of that opened up. But what was behind that decision to say, hey, I'm going to go in front of the camera. I'm going to take that personal risk?
Just the fact that the opportunity came my way.
Yeah.
You see, because I didn't get an opportunity before that, ever. There was not a single acting offer. There was not a single, oh, you know, she's cute or she's pretty, or, you know, let's give her a shot. Never. So when Ashwini Yardi, who was the producer of the show, she just put this whole thing together. I said, really, you think I could front a show? And by the way, no one asked me if I could act. Nobody took an audition or took a test. And I remember the director, Sonam Nair, was hilarious. She said, oh my God, we have to do a reading. And I just realized that we've never done a reading with you. We don't even know if you can speak in front of camera, because a lot of people can't speak in front of camera. So I said, okay.
You assumed it was genetic.
And Hindi, English.
Yeah.
So there was that. I said, you know what? Make it more Hindi, less English. Because I speak really good Hindi. And the whole world believes I can't speak Hindi to save my life. My Hindi is damn good. So make it about Hindi. And I said, this is going to be me controlling my narrative. Finally. So each season, each time we did something, every few episodes, you know, whenever we talk, I would say, this is my launch pad. You know, like how you dream of a debut where you're coming out of the water and you have washboard abs. Said, make me speak Hindi, you know, let's shock them, because no one believes I can. So I went with it with a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of positivity.
So when you're acting, vis-a-vis when you're in your office doing your thing as the founder of the House of Masaba, what feels more like you?
Both. You won't believe it.
Yeah.
I love both. I absolutely love being on a set, even if it's for a talk like this, you know, or if it's for, I recently shot a song for a film. It was great. Just 2 days of shoot. I really enjoyed it. Even if it's for an hour, 45 minutes, just, you know, shooting a piece to camera about a brand or something. I really enjoyed it. I feel very much like myself. And when I'm in office and I'm writing down my notes, and I'm also making sure everything is aligned and checking fabric and checking for what are we going to do next and what's the next challenge, what's the next collection. It all feels, and now with the beauty brand, I cannot tell you how much fun I have. I sit and I swatch every product myself. I sit and I look at the packaging and I say, you know what, not this color, not that. Let's call it Nimbu Pani. Let's not call it that. Let's call it Jamun Cooler. I have a blast. Everything feels like me, which is why I think that I'm quite a chameleon. I keep saying that.
I love your Love Child collection. I've told you this before.
Yes,
there's
you
one
carry
lipstick.
my lipstick around.
There's one lipstick that I really love. And I'm just one of those people, if I find something I like, I'll just stick with it, right? I'm not someone who experiments. And what I love about it is the amount of respect it has for skin color.
Yes.
And the fact that it's not limiting, saying that, okay, if you're this skin color, you can't do all these shades. It makes you, because I remember when we were growing up, there was this idea that Indian women can't do reds.
Yeah, it was
You can't
tacky.
do maroons. And it's like, you know, it was tacky. And it was too, I don't know, it was too something.
Loud.
It was too loud. It was too something, whatever it was. It was just not okay. And you have this collection now that makes it okay. Where, you know, you can, it just feels, it feels cared for. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. And you've also talked about the fact that because you're mixed race, when you were growing up, you faced a lot of comments about skin color.
Yeah. I think I still do.
Even now?
Oh, yeah, of course.
And you're not punching those people in the face?
No, I think that, I don't know if that's the right response.
Yeah?
I
Because
don't
I feel
think-
like we're very different now than we were back then.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. It's subtler now. It's a way more subtle way of saying something now. But there's always like an underlying emotion that this skin color, this dark, this dusky, there's something. There's something. It's not all settled. And I don't think it ever will. At least
That
for the
is
next
so
decade.
sad.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Because, I mean, I grew up with two other sisters and we're similar, but shades are different. And my sister would keep telling me that, no, you don't know what it's like. I'm darker than you. And it gets pointed out a lot. It's a really big deal.
Yeah. It's almost like, so see, the thing is, we aren't really the whole of India, right? We are a lot more well-traveled. We're a lot more we have a view of the world. We have a view of what it's like to be mixed gender and not mixed gender, mixed ethnicity, what it's like to have different types of skin, not just texture, color,
Yes.
different hair, right? Because we've seen that. So it's kind of, we now get it.
Yeah.
But there is still, I mean, what was it? Just very recently, it happened to me just yesterday where I had somebody come in for some prenatal something, and she said, you must eat a rasgulla every day because your kid has to turn out lighter than you. And then 15 days before that, I was getting another prenatal massage because that's what I do. And she said to me that, "Aap na doodh liya karo."
First of all, the level of unscientific nonsense, but that aside.
Yeah. Savli nahi honi chahiye. Savla nahi hona chahiye. Whatever. So it was that. It was, and it was said with so much innocence and so much as if this is,
Yeah.
and you have no choice. What can I do? Punch my masseuse? No.
Yes.
I mean, because they, and of course, then
No, you did say that that's not the acceptable response. I'll take your word for it. But what is the acceptable response? How do you deal with it?
You raise a child that hopefully has the resilience to power through it. That's all you do. That is literally all you do. There's no other way. Because it's not going to change. It'll be spoken of in hushed tones because, certain things are now not politically correct.
Yes.
But it'll be spoken of. The number of times people think that calling somebody Kali is actually is a way of like putting them down. I find that just so absurd. And these tricks and these and it's not just, I'm just giving you an example of a masseuse or somebody who's coming who comes from a certain section of society. You'll be shocked at how many educated, wealthy, well-read, well-educated people also feel this way. And I'm witness to it. I'm witness to it till today. It's 2024. Not much has changed, which is why I know a lot of people think that I keep sort of going on and on about the color of my skin and I keep talking about it and I have this aggression in me. It's because I see it. Yeah. I see it every step of the way. And now I know why my father felt so strongly about it for so many years. Until today, if you ask him, he'll have tears in his eyes, or he'll have this rage in him, where he will answer with a lot of pride that that he grew up in the worst of times. He played professional cricket in a time where the color of your skin came in the way of
your ability to
move ahead in the world, and I mean, it's there, Faye. It's there everywhere. It'll keep being spoken of until we really fight for it, and it's only going to happen if everybody fights for it. A lot of people talk about other people's kids and say, "I wish my child was that color." Yeah.
There is apparently a lot of cosmetic procedures that people are now getting done to lighten skin color. I find it deeply disturbing.
I think because, that's the thing, Faye. I have learned over time how to fight it.
Yeah.
or to be in moments quiet about it when I don't have a choice but to be quiet about it, or in moments where I get my opportunity, I really speak about it. But the thing is, not everyone has that kind of a fight in them. What do? You go ahead and you call your doormat and say, please make me acceptable. What do? I keep seeing it where, you know how lighting plays such a big part in how you look. And there'll be times when I've done a shoot where the lighting is slightly different and I'm looking a little bit more light-skinned than I am. And someone will say, "Isne bhi kara liya procedure." You know, how is your skin so fair? You know, somebody commented the other day, and it's not just about the color of your skin. Someone said to me the other day on Instagram, I had done this video and we actually decided not to put a filter on it because I said, you know, it's a skin tint that I'm showing people, and if I put a filter on it, it looks kind of blurred, like I have whatever. And someone said, but what are you doing? What are you doing with a makeup brand? You have skin like Om Puri. Can you imagine? I mean, what business does anyone have to talk about anything except Om Puri's acting talent?
Yeah.
But the fact is that God bless him, and you see, people see him, certain people see him, or people see people with textured skin or skin that has acne scars, and that's all they see. Yeah. Which is why I have to keep doing more, and I have to keep being more and more successful in the real sense, because that's my fight. And hopefully, you know, 10 years down the line, someone will say, I could see beyond her scars, and I could see her achievements, and I could see that it's not just her body or her physicality, but what she really brings to the table. And I think that's what you do. The response is, the acceptable response is to have a fight within you and shut them up with the work that you do, I think.
I remember seeing on your Instagram recently, you visited the island where your dad lives. What's that like? What is, you know, what's that part of the world like? What is life like there? How do you feel when, you know, when you're in the West Indies?
How I feel today is very different from how I felt the first time I went.
Okay. How old were you when you went first time?
I was all of, gosh, I must be 15 or 16. And I had a culture shock. Because, one, you have women who are so comfortable in their bodies. Yeah. You know, they don't give a damn. They don't give a damn about anything, really, literally. And they're out there on the streets doing their thing. It's almost like a parallel universe where, you know, when you say, you know how you see movies and you see people on the corner of the street eating these exotic fruits and also doing a little dance, and they're also listening to music, but they're also working. You know, it's the ideal situation. It is amazing. But I had a culture shock because I said, wow, you have one, everyone knows the other person. That's how small the island is. And, you know, you have my dad drive down and he's just windows down, saying hello to every fifth person. There is no hierarchy. Yeah. There's no star power. And I mean, this is the same father who's on a giant hoarding in all of Antigua at all times, but also drives his own car, picks up his own groceries, drives around and says hello to everyone, from the fruit seller to it is an incredible world. And it's safe. It is, it's magical, because I, for the first time, saw that people were so comfortable in their own skin. Everyone is just waiting to break into song and dance. Yeah. Everyone is in that state of mind. And it's green. You turn around, suddenly there's enough blue. There's enough of the hills. There's enough of great food. You know, like the waiter would be a friend of my dad's from school or something. Or when I went to the airport, the guy who was helping me with my luggage was a friend of his from school, and they were having a chat in the corner. And there is no, and I remember the first time I went, I saw my dad had come to get me, and he was just sitting around in the airport, unbothered. Yeah. He had his cap on his face and he was taking a nap, waiting for me, So it's just, there's no, because I was like, oh, security and this and that is going to be a whole thing. None of it. So they're living in a parallel universe. They're living in a time where everybody's one, and great aesthetic. You have walls that are green and blue and yellow all at the same time, and it just works. And if you're lucky, you will just stroll into a supermarket, or you'll stroll into a little restaurant for a drink or for an afternoon swim or something, and there'll be Andy Roberts just hanging around there, and everyone's just pals.
Yeah.
So it's such a different world from Mumbai.
As a teenager, was there ever a moment where you're like, I don't want to do this anymore, I'm going to the island? I don't live here anymore because it's just too...
No, I've become too hardwired into city life. When I go there now, I go there and I enjoy it. I enjoy the break. I enjoy all of that. But I don't think that I've become a hardwired, like...
Mumbaikar. Yeah.
Like, just give me the traffic. I must sit in the car for an hour. I love my little world here too.
Yeah.
To be honest, I like the frenzy of Mumbai. And I like the pace. But I know that most days when I'm fretting, I know that my dad's out in the water, in the sea, all by himself on a 2-hour swim. And he will probably eat the best mango of his life.
Of your parents, and I'll ask about your mum as well, what is the strongest thing your dad has taught you? If you were to think back, saying, okay, this is what I learned from him, this is what I apply into my life, what would that be?
Literally and figuratively, always play on the front foot. Always. And I think he is... How do I say it? He is such an individual, and he's so complete on his own that he needs no one. He is content by himself. He went out there and achieved the greatest of things that, a sports person could. He has respect. He has a lot of self-respect. And he does things at his own pace, in his own time, in his own way. And I don't think that he wastes time with small talk or being seen everywhere or heard at everything or being connected to the rest of the world. I think he very much said that my purpose into this world was to come out there, play great cricket, empower my people through that great cricket, and then retreat into my own shell. And I think that I'm in many ways like that.
In fact, in context of the conversation we're having, a lot of people say that sport teaches you failure and teaches you how to deal with failure, because it's just two sides of a coin.
And how to deal with it alone. Yeah. Right? Because, see, tennis is an individual sport. When I'm out there, I do the pep talk, and I can do the self-destructive talk. I can take it anywhere. So I mostly did the self-destructive talk, but now I know how to channel that into pep talk. So when you're out there, there's nobody telling you, hey, there's no teammate coming over and saying, listen, man, you got this, hang in there. You are doing it all yourself. You're playing multiple roles on the tennis court. But I think that sport, and for a child to play sport, is the single greatest gift you can give them.
And it's interesting now, women in sports and, how far it's come. I was just thinking today about women like Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka, who have put their mental health first. And there was a lot of dismissal of them.
Yeah.
When they said, no, for a mental health point of view, I'm backing out until I feel better. And everyone dismissed them as whiny little girls. And
Yeah.
they've both come back so much stronger now.
Yeah.
And said, this time I'm doing it for me. Simone Biles said, this time I'm going to the Olympics. I'm doing it for me. I don't care about anybody else's pressure. And that for me is such a journey for women in sport.
Absolutely. And when I was playing sport, I remember there was no word such as mental health.
Yeah. There was no word for it.
There was no word for it. You just didn't know what you're going through. You were just considered weak. If I cried after I lost a point, you're weak. My coach said, you are weak. If I screamed very hard or broke my racket, and I broke a lot of rackets, you are weak. And when you're a teenager, you anyway don't know how to cope with a lot of your emotion. So I remember training very hard for the physical. I would be on court from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. I would change in the, at the court where there was a little washroom and everything. I would change there, shower, get into my school uniform. I had permission to come late and miss the first period. And I would go into school at about 10, be in school the whole day, get into the car, eat in the car, have a snack at about 4 p.m., get to the court, change, and play until 7. And then from 7 to 8, do a conditioning and strength session. That was my life.
For how many years?
For, I would say a good 5-6 years.
You played under 16.
I remember I played the Maharashtra Open and I played under 16, I played under 14. Miserable at it. But there was just one spark where I remember I was at one point Maharashtra number 2 and I was very happy. And then I went to Sangli to play a game and I was on court and I had this beautiful tennis dress that my father got me. And at that time to get like a Nike tennis dress was like a big deal. And it had an attached ball holder inside my shorts, which everyone was like, what is she wearing? Like, where's this from? And I remember I lost that match and I was walking back and I could hear someone say, it's a pity that Viv Richards' daughter just has a fancy tennis outfit and not the
chops, or
not the chops to be a tennis superstar. And I think that was my last match.
I'm assuming, stitching it back to what you said earlier, that would have been a difficult period because if tennis was taking up that much time and then for it to be gone, plus feeling like you can't act because you were told that you would not get that space or you can't. Did you feel a sense of, oh my God, what am I going to do with my life?
I never had the thought that, oh my God, what am I going to do with my life? I never had it. I just felt like, if I can't sing, I'll dance. If I can't dance, I'll sing. If I can't do either, I'll make beautiful clothes. Because I was at that time already creating things for myself. Okay. I was into fashion, So, I mean, it was a great joy for me to get the most beautiful tennis dress that like Sharapova, whoever was the thing at the time had. And I also had the same one. And I remember my dad got me Andre Agassi's racket. He just casually came over one day and he said, Andre just gave this to me. He heard you're playing tennis, so that's his racket. And I went and smashed that racket in one of my, fits. But yeah, so how it is. So I was very excited by things, and I was excited that I was going to a cousin's wedding in Chicago for the first time, and I wanted to create a sari for myself. So I made it from scratch. So there was the fashion that was already kicking in, and then there was all the I like my mom's makeup, and I like pretty things. So I'll figure something out.
So we haven't talked about your mom. I think she's amazing. She is. She's amazing. What have you learned from her? I mean, obviously everything, but what stands out?
Just have a great sense of humor about life. And it's the only way to make it out alive. Because I don't think that she has ever... And now I have this conversation with her even more because I am so overwhelmed some days in my pregnancy where I say, I wouldn't know what I would do if I didn't have my husband or I didn't have her. She didn't have her mom around. Her mom passed away when she was very young. So when she was pregnant with me, she didn't have her mom around. Her father was kind of against it because, of course, it was out of wedlock. My father wasn't around. Friends were around, but it's not the same. I think everyone had their life. And she couldn't tell people that she was pregnant with me. So she had to hide her pregnancy. So it was, I just said, how did you do this? I mean, I need on some days 4 people around me and I need that attention and that comfort. And that's how I make it through that day. And she didn't have money. Right? So I remember the other day I was telling her, I said, I need to eat more protein and something, this is not there. And she's like, I didn't have money to eat protein. You turned out just fine. Just get over it.
There's a lot of that, yes.
There's a lot of that. So I just think that in many ways, and I asked her, I said, so how did you make it through the pregnancy? She said, I was just so happy to be having a child of my own or something of my own. And I didn't know how I would have you, how I would raise you, where I would raise you, which school, what. No clue. It's just, I went through with it. I was just so happy. So I think I've learned from her how to have a sense of humor.
When you were growing up, when you were in school and in college, did people ever use it snidely against you that you were born out of wedlock, that your parents were not married?
Yeah. 100%.
Because it was public, everybody knew.
It was public and it was, you see, the thing is, it was very interesting because the kids would speak about it like adults, right? Or I could hear that they were saying something or repeating something they heard in their house. So like one kid went on to say, hey, bastard, I believe you are a bastard child. And he said it in this tone. And I said, do you even know
at what age?
This is 7th grade. And a lot of people also didn't understand how I looked physically or why I looked like that. So there was a lot of the catcalling from the boys about my body. And I was a professional tennis player. So I had these shoulders and I had ripped arms and I had ripped legs. And I also developed very early. So I had breasts and I had a butt, and it was just, they were like, what is this thing? Not dainty, not feminine, skin and acne and an afro and like, but she speaks like us, so where is this thing from? So I think it was there, but I was very happy in my own bubble in school. I did my own thing. I had a bunch of friends. I didn't make great friends in school, I have to say, which I regret. About maybe 2 or 3 of them who I still hold very dear today. But apart from that, I don't remember meeting very high quality people. Yeah, and I mean, they were all possible.
I meant to ask you this when it happened. One of the Kardashians wore a Manish Malhotra outfit and then wrote on Instagram, they said on Instagram, this is by a local designer.
Yes.
I can't remember the name.
Yes, I remember this.
And I remember feeling very personally offended by it.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with me, but I was watching it and I was just like, I was deeply offended. I was like, what do you mean? Because, from when you started to where we are today, Indian fashion has made a giant leap from where we are at this point.
Yeah.
What was your reaction to the fact that she couldn't remember his name?
I thought it was rude too.
Yeah.
Because I think that when a designer puts in even 10% of work or 100% of work, I know in Manish's case it must be 500% because that's who he is. I think, and the thing is, this would not happen with an international designer.
Yes.
That's what got me. It wouldn't happen with an international actor either, or an international stylist. It happened because of the fact that, oh, we're here and, we're at this.
Yeah,
at
so
this
we don't have to
wedding.
bother to learn anybody's names.
Yeah, I mean, it's a matter of turning around and asking your assistant who has created this work,
Yeah.
But I think, to be honest, to give them the benefit of doubt, I don't know how overwhelming that situation must have been. Because there was back-to-back stuff, I don't know. But the thing is that it is your business that
Yeah.
when someone is making the effort to put in man hours to make an outfit for you and putting together a look for you, I think it's your business to know who that piece belongs to. I do think that. That's the bare minimum, because I don't think that, sure, you do make up for it and you tag the person and this and that and all those things happen. But I just think it's your business, because I know it would be your business if you were back home. And I believe that. And I think that I feel very strongly about it, that people do give credit to designers for everything that they do.
So the Indian market for luxury designer wear has really opened up.
Yes, it has.
It has, right?
Good for us.
Yes, well done. From where you're sitting right now, what do you see as the future for this market?
It's such
Is it all weddings or is there more?
Oh, the beauty is that there's more.
Yes.
And it's such a ripe time to be in India, to be a brand, to be a designer, because India is so dynamic right now. India is suddenly discovering that, like you said, there's more to luxury than weddings.
Yes.
Luxury means the fact that you have a Tiffany & Co. that's opened up in a mall here. You have a Cartier that's opened up in a mall here. You have luxury brands completely focusing on India at the moment. The fact that a beautiful timepiece or a beautiful watch means as much as a lehenga, or the fact that a simple gold bangle that doesn't really speak of anything loud but just craftsmanship, or the fact that craftsmanship is getting the attention that it deserves, is suddenly opening up the minds of Indians. The fact that, and I find that's blowing up in the jewelry segment especially, because suddenly you have the new Indian woman realize that I don't really care about a massive piece for a bridal wedding piece for my wedding
That I'm never going to wear again.
that I'm never going to wear again. I do care deeply about what I want to wear with a white shirt.
Yeah.
Are these Basra pearls, or is this a Muzo diamond, Muzo emerald, or is this something that, and what is the clarity in the cut of this diamond? Suddenly you have Indians asking these very important questions, where traditionally we were a gold market.
Yeah.
We looked at jewelry as investment pieces. Suddenly you have precious stones that are making their way into the country, and it's amazing. You have, the fact that you can own a MAC lipstick and have regard for it, and also say, I don't mind trying out Love Child. I think that's luxury. That's luxury. And the fact that people today are paying money for Indian homegrown brands, which they only traditionally spent for international brands, is a big leap.
Yeah.
You're suddenly asking, is this Japanese cotton?
Yeah.
And if it is, I don't mind paying that extra buck for it.
Yeah.
But I also think my fast fashion will continue to exist and coexist. I do see that as a trend, but I just think suddenly there's this, what leather is this? So,
Are there larger questions about sustainability, about responsibly sourced? Is that happening in the Indian market as well?
It's happening on Instagram.
It's not happening. It's not happening in the store.
No, not yet. Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet, but it's happening on Instagram, where suddenly you have, people questioning, do we really need leather? Do we really need to have so many things? Do we need these extra pair of shoes? Should we buy that one dress, which is going to cost us a bomb, instead of buying 20 things from a fast fashion website? There's all of that. But then you also see a market trend. You have a brand like Zudio doing exceptionally well. You have, there's always going to be a little bit of a tug of war between sustainability and well, sustainability on Instagram and sustainability in the real sense. That's what I believe. But I think that it's an important conversation because fashion is known to be one of the greatest polluters in the world. So it is a conversation we need to have. But I just think that sustainability requires sustainability, and it also requires capital.
Yeah.
And it needs to be done in a way that you can keep up with it.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you do one talk and talk about sustainability. If I can't hold on to that story for the next decade in my business, how am I helping?
Yeah.
I'm just dumping the idea of sustainability onto someone who doesn't really get it. So, I mean, there's this whole conversation, for example, about packaging in beauty, right? Where one lipstick will come in a massive box sometimes.
Yes.
Right?
In one plastic, in one box, in
one thing, and wrap. The thing is, if you get down to it, sure, there are ways to solve it. There are expensive ways to solve it. Can every brand afford it? Not really. Can some brands afford it? Absolutely. Do brands always have the R&D teams to put that together? Sometimes, but not all the time. Majority don't. Secondly, there are things that there has to be some understanding of the limitations of the Indian market. We don't have all kinds of packaging available in the country. It's the absolute truth.
Yeah.
How do I ship something to you and then not have you be upset
Products
about...
go through a lot through shipping, right?
Yeah, and then if you get a broken piece, that's also trouble, right? And that's also not sustainable because you'll order another one. Then there'll be that, and then that will go to waste, Like someone told me the other day that faux leather is actually not as sustainable as real leather because faux leather takes, lesser time to just completely unravel and deteriorate. And you'll need the other faux leather bag quickly, but leather stands the test of time. But is it sustainable in the larger scheme of things? No. Is being non-vegetarian sustainable? I don't know. I mean, there's just so many things, there's so many layers. I was reading the other day, some portal put up how long it'll take for a dress.
Yes, I read that as well.
Yes,
Your
and
pure cotton t-shirt vis-a-vis something, vis-a-vis polyester being the worst of it.
Polyester being the worst of it.
Yeah.
So I think it's all starting now because everyone's starting to get the message that climate change is real. But at the same time, I think one needs to see at what stage a brand is at to offer that. There's a reason why you have the giants of the world saying that, we'll be sustainable in 2046.
Yeah.
I mean, do you need the new phone every time it launches? But that's also a question on sustainability, right? But don't be selective about sustainability. Yeah. Pick it up in every aspect of your life, or don't really talk about it.
What is your advice to someone who wants to get into the business now? Young person, straight out of college. Where do they go? How do they start?
Gosh, I think I would say first and foremost have a great sense and grip of reality about where you stand in your offering. Because I think, see, today we've become a lot more complex as a brand. We do bridal, we do festive wear, we do ready to wear, we do print, we do everything. But when I first started off, I remember nobody was doing the cool, quirky sari or the lightweight sari. And that was the gap that we tried to fill. So I think always think about the gap that you're trying to fill first. Today it's even harder because the gaps are smaller and you have lots of brands. You have a brand that is being run in a small garage. You have a giant, a retail giant that is offering you the same thing, same quality sometimes, better even, the smaller brands. So I think it's harder to fill that gap, but I think it's important to ask yourself that question. Because if you're just a Me Too brand, I think it's even harder to get your feet off the ground. Yeah. And I would say that if there's no plan and trajectory in your head, I'm not saying it has to be a 5-year or 10-year plan. I don't have one either. But I think if it's not a rough plan in your head or a roadmap in your head about where you want to go, you'll always be influenced by everyone's opinion of your work. And I think that's the worst thing that can happen to a designer.
Masaba, thank you so much
Thank you.
for this entire conversation. It's been brilliant.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate your time, and I wish you very good luck
Thank you.
for all the wonderful things
Thank
in the coming year. Thank you.
so much. Thank you.